and place me on the rock that stands, and I hold true to the one who breaks my fall and lifts me time and time again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. Yeah. This freedom purchased by the highest price, this grace outweighing all my shame. 'Cause I'm made new through the power of sacrifice. From death now raised to life again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. You set this joy in my heart. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good. Buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I praise your name as long as I'm breathing. 'Cause you are good. Come on. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good. Buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I praise your name as long as I'm breathing. 'Cause you are good, yeah. Oh my God, so good, you never give up. Because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love, because of your love for me. I'm singing, I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. 'Cause you are good. Buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. 'Cause you are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. 'Cause you are good. So I praise your name as long as I'm breathing. 'Cause you are good, yeah. You are good to us, God. Oh, you never give it up.
Welcome to Crossroads at Montgomery. We are super excited you are able to join us today. If this is your first time here, I'm Ben, the worship director here at Crossroads. If this isn't your first time here, you already know me, so welcome back. Today, we're going to be continuing our series in 1 Timothy. We are super excited as we come towards a spearhead here at the end of our study in 1 Timothy. But today is going to be a little bit different. We're not specifically going to be looking at 1 Timothy, but the whole title of our series was called The Church Ought To. And the reason we chose that was because the whole reason 1 Timothy was written was to tell the church how they ought to behave and act in certain situations. Today, we want to specifically take a look at how we as a church should respond and act in our culture and our situations today. And what better way to open that up than to sing a song that focuses our eyes on Him. You are our vision, O King of our heart. So why don't you join me as we worship Him together. You are my vision, O King of my heart. Nothing else satisfies, only you, Lord. You are my best thought, by day or by night. Waking or sleeping, your presence my light. Oh, you are my wisdom, you are my true word. I ever with you and you with me, Lord. You're my great Father and I'm your true Son. You dwell inside me, together we're one. Oh, you are my battle shield, sword for the fight. You are my dignity, you're my delight. You're my soul shelter, and you're my high tower. Come raise me heavenward, O power of my power. Oh, I don't want riches or man's empty praise. You're my inheritance now and always. You and you only, the first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure you are. Oh, High King of heaven, when victory's won, may I reach heaven's joy, oh bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, oh ruler of all. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, oh ruler of all. Oh,
Well, here we are. Let the daddy-daughter camping weekend begin.
Awesome. I'm so excited.
I know, me too. Yes, honey?
What's going on?
What do you mean?
What are we doing?
We're camping.
Are we gonna get out of the car?
No. No, it's way too dangerous out there.
What's dangerous?
What's dangerous? Do you see the plants everywhere? There's literally millions of insects hiding out there, and every one of them is just dying to plunge its needle snout into your skin and suck your blood. All the while squirting unholy diseases into your veins. Is that what you want? And then there's the razor sharp rocks that you could skin your knees on. That cut gets infected, bam, gangrene. You lose a leg. Do you like your legs? Do you like your legs or not?
Yes, I like my legs.
And then there's the bears, the wolves, the rats, the coyotes, the terrorists. You don't want to go out there.
Can we at least open a window?
Pollen, mold, airborne diseases, smog.
Fine.
Hot dog?
No, thank you. You know, Dad, it's hard to live your life if you never get out of the car.
Well, hey, Crossroads. So what do you think? That's kind of cute, isn't it? If you can't relate to that, I don't know. We all feel a little bit of what we see in the video, just a little bit of apprehension these days. And it's a good reminder. The only way to live your life is to step out. Well, hey, this is Pastor Mike, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us here at Crossroads this morning. Over the last few weeks, we've been doing a study of the book of 1 Timothy, and we're going to kind of wrap that up today and next week. But before we do get into that, I just wanted to say on behalf of my wife Cindy and I want to thank all of you who reached out to comfort her and encourage her regarding the death of her brother Tom. Your care meant a lot to us, so thanks for that. I also want to mention a few other people that need prayer. Janet Sahauna wrote in. She's, of course, living in Lancaster now, but her oldest brother-in-law, Toma, he's 73 years old. He's a physician living in Alabama. He's got COVID-19, and he received a convalescent plasma transfer, and he's continuing to decline. He's probably going to go on a ventilator any time now. And she just asked for prayer for him. The hospital there is actually looking for more people to donate blood who have survived COVID. So you can imagine the tension there. Cindy and I experienced it this week as we dealt with her brother's death. The people are dying so fast in Florida that her brother's body was handed off to 3 different organizations before somebody had enough manpower to go pick him up. So there are places that are really struggling. And the fact that we here in Pennsylvania aren't in one of those places, we're just really thankful for now. Also, I want to ask you guys to be praying for Shen Ping and her father. Her father lives in China, and he's been having some health issues. He's had another rupture in his small intestine, and so she just asked us to be praying for her. And of course, we're all thankful for God's protection during this past storm this week. We did have a small swimming pool down here in the basement of the church, but that happens whenever there's a heavy rain, so we're thankful. Even the canopy is still standing, which is amazing. So we're thankful for that. At the same time, we realize that not everybody had that same level of protection, and so our hearts go out to them. Well, we've studied the book of 1 Timothy. We did an exposition. We did, I think, 8 messages on the book of Timothy. Today, we're not going to be doing an exposition of the book. Instead, I hope today and next Sunday, we can do a little bit of an exposition of the world that we're living in. You know, if all we did was to study the meaning of ancient texts that were inspired writings, we could be accused of sticking our heads in the sand. But you see, we believe that the Bible should make a difference in the world that we live in our lives and the world around us. And so today and next week, we're going to be looking at the Bible and what it has to say about the world that we're living in right now. I don't know how you've been feeling, but I continue to experience this roller coaster of different feelings, different concerns, different emotions. Sometimes it's anxiety, sometimes it's frustration, sometimes it's just bewilderment, and sometimes it's just flat out depression, because some of us, when there isn't anything that we can do, it bothers us. I don't know what you're feeling, but I'll bet you're like me and you're experiencing some of that. So how do we process what we're experiencing during this pandemic? And what does 1 Timothy have to say? Here, we just studied a letter where Christians are being instructed about how the church should respond, how it ought to conduct itself. And that should apply to the world that we're living in right now. So what are we supposed to do as the church in a time like this? Now, one of the books that I read this week that I want to highly recommend, it's by N.T. Wright, a British scholar, and the title is God and the Pandemic, A Christian Reflection on the Coronavirus. So it's pretty recent. And I want to read you just 2 little paragraphs. I'm going to just read it right from his book. I printed it out here. And I think you'll enjoy this. He writes, I was reminded of the ironic quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller. Now, there are several versions of what he might have said, but the point is the same. Speaking about the 1930s Germany, he said, first they came for the Jews, but I did nothing because I'm not a Jew. Then they came for the socialists, but I did nothing because I'm not a socialist. Then they came for the Catholics, but I did nothing because I'm not a Catholic. Finally, they came for me, but by then there was no one left to help me. So now N.T. Wright goes on. So it has been, I thought, with the British and American reaction to the coronavirus. First, it hit the Chinese, but we aren't Chinese. And anyway, China is far away, and they eat strange things. Then it hit Iran, but we didn't worry because Iran too is very far away. And anyway, it's such a different place than here. Then it struck Italy. And we thought, well, the Italians are sociable, tactile people. Of course it will spread there, but we'll be all right. And then it arrived in London and in New York. And suddenly there was no safe space on the planet. There was no neutral zone. There was no medical equivalent of a wartime Switzerland where you could escape to for a while and relax or ponder what ought to be done. He writes, so does anybody know what's going on? Why is this happening? Is someone trying to tell us something? What are we supposed to do about it? Can you feel those feelings? Yeah, me too. Now let's be clear. Disasters happened all the time in the ancient world. Earthquakes, floods, plagues. When they happened, some people thought it was because you didn't give the right offering to some god. Other philosophers back then kind of fell into a few groups. One group were the Stoics. And the Stoics would say things like, hey, everything is preordained. It's going to happen the way it's going to happen no matter what we do. You can't change it, so just learn to deal with it. And they would motor on. The Epicureans were another group. Now, what they would say is, everything is random and chance, but you still can't change it. Whatever happens, happens. So just do your best to be comfortable and happy. And then there were the Platonists, followers of Plato, and they would say, look, this life isn't real. It's really just a shadow. Bad things happen in this world, but they don't happen in the next world, and that's what's really important. Now, what's funny is today we have modern day equivalents of those philosophies, don't we? You got the people who say, hey, just live your life. You know, if that corona bullet has your name on it, so be it. And then you got another group that says, bad stuff happens, so do your best to avoid it. You know, self-isolate. Have all your food delivered. Order up plenty of Netflix. Be as comfortable as you can. And then some Christians sound like Platonists. What they talk all the time about what happens in the next life and how that matters so much more than what happens now. So just look past all this and instead focus on what's coming next. Can you see yourself in any of those groups? I see myself in all three. I've said something similar to all three of those groups. So, how should we be responding to the things around us? Now, I want to set your heart at ease. Next week, I'm going to have some more things that I think maybe we can do. Today, I just want to talk about what we're experiencing and feeling. Now, when I was trying to figure out how do we respond, my first instinct was to make like a flow chart. Some people call it a decision tree of ideas and concepts, and these ideas and concepts that have been plaguing me. Now, so I started, kind of looks like this. And down yes, no. And I thought maybe if I could just kind of get a system and a yes, no flow chart, I would know what we should do. So there were COVID medical questions, like how contagious is the virus? I don't know. What do the experts say? Well, which experts? It seems like one expert says something different from another expert, and then they all change within a day or two because they're still learning. How do I keep safe? How do I keep others safe? Whose information can I trust? And as I started trying to make my little chart, it didn't work at all. What about precautions? I mean, I know you can take some precautions, but how much of a precaution should I take? And is it worth the cost or the discomfort? What is a reasonable risk? There's the COVID news, not just the medical stuff, but the news, the infection rate and the announcements, ups and downs, and it's going crazy there and nothing here. And who do I believe? Where do I get my news? That's one thing I learned is wherever you get your news, that greatly affects what side of the whole debate you're on. What practices are best? That's changing. Schools should open. Schools shouldn't open. They announce that they're opening. Then they announce that they're not opening. What about businesses? What about churches? What should they do? Next week, we're going to talk specifically about church and what we should do. Economic issues. Everybody thinks it's important to be safe. Unless, of course, you're starving or you're broke or you're going to be made homeless. What is a reasonable risk? And then you got the politics. You got claims and positions on both sides, and you kind of feel like the truth and the science isn't nearly as important as who scores points. Of course, it's an election year, so what do you expect? What about the loss of freedoms versus health and safety? Who do I believe? And what don't I know? I only know what others are telling me, so I'm kind of at their mercy. And then there's these justice issues. Issues related to the appropriate use of force by individuals, but then also by police and organizations. There's racial prejudice. And again, we discover that it can be kind of infecting areas and we don't even know. What about protesting, which is an American right, and yet protesting and rioting, are they different or are they the same? And what about the cancel culture, right? How are we supposed to view our own history? I've got news for everybody. If we look close enough, every figure in history is going to have some foibles and faults. And depending on what's happening in our culture, they might be so offensive that somehow we're going to erase all of them from our history. Now, all of these things push buttons for me, they push buttons for you. There's got to be an answer. There's got to be an explanation. There must be a right way to figure this out. That's part of why I've been struggling the last few weeks. I've been trying to figure out, Jesus, come on. If you were here, I know what you would do. I know you know what's going on. I know you have the answer. And so if I just seek you enough, I can find your answer. And so far, he hasn't told me anything. You know, maybe if you're like me, see, in response to all the rationalist views that have been around the last few hundred years, you know, science proves that Christianity is false. And so I want to respond by saying, wait a minute, my Christian faith is rational. It's not just, it's not something I believe because things go bump in the night. That what I believe actually has rational, even sometimes scientific basis. It makes sense. Science can even support it. And I've struggled so hard in my life, maybe you too, to say my faith is rational that now I've kind of swung too far the other way. And I find myself believing that there must be an answer for everything that goes on. If we just have the facts, then it'll make sense. See, we think we should be able to see what God is up to. But to be honest, most of the time, we are not given that kind of access to his purposes. And so that brought me to the story of Job. I hope most of you know that story. If not, you look it up after we're done. But Job, probably the oldest part of the scriptures that we have, Job was a righteous, God-fearing man, and he lost everything. First, he lost all of his businesses and his income. Then he lost his family, and then he lost his health. And his friends come by, and they say, what they say to him is the going theory, which is, hey, if this kind of stuff happens to you, you must have unconfessed sin. Confess your sin so God stops judging you. And Job says, wait a minute, if that's what's going on here, then God isn't just because I'm not aware of any sin. As it turns out, both of them were wrong. God is not unjust, but it wasn't because of Job's sin. In fact, the only reason we know what that story is really about is because the reader alone gets to look behind the curtain and learns what the genesis of all that going on in Job's life was. See, every story in the Bible has at least two levels. There's the story at the surface, the circumstances, the characters, the plot. But then there's the bigger, broader storyline. What is God doing on his scale? And we don't want to admit it, but unless God gives us insight into his broader plan, we just can't know what that is. So how do you respond when things are happening around you that don't make sense, that don't seem just, that feel out of control? How are we supposed to respond? Now, depends on if you're a Stoic or an Epicurean or a Platonist, right? Well, the Bible has at least one answer, and it's found in the word lament. Now, this word means a lot to Cindy and I. We spent the better part of early in this year every day reading through one of the lament psalms. Almost a full third of the psalms are lament psalms, and we read one each day. You see, lament is the process of expressing to God feelings of pain or disappointment or discouragement or complaint. Here's an example, Psalm 88, starting in verse 3, we read this. I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lay in the grave, who you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. Verse 14, he says, why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I've suffered, and I've been close to death. I have borne your terrors, and I am in despair. Verse 18, you have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. Whew. Okay, now that's probably not the kind of stuff that you choose to read in your devotions. And yet they make up a large portion of the scriptures. In fact, there's an entire book called Lamentations. So what is the value of lament? And how does it affect what we're talking about today? Well, first of all, I think it's important that we be honest about what we're feeling. I'm thinking that if you are like me, many of the feelings that you have been struggling with, some of them you're suppressing, some of them you're denying, but the truth is the feelings are like lament. You don't like what's going on. It doesn't make sense to you. It feels like it's out of control, and you are suffering. Well, the value of lament, first of all, is that it's honest. I mean, you can say all the right things, but who do you think you're kidding besides yourself? This period is difficult. And as time goes on, it's getting more difficult, not less. Another value of lament is that it explores. It looks for meaning even when there isn't any to be found. Now, T.S. Eliot wrote a beautiful passage about this, but we don't have time this morning to get into it. And so maybe I could share it with you some other way. But he wrote during the bombing of London, the idea that, like, here we are looking for meaning, and all I see is darkness. But there's value in at least asking the questions. Thirdly, it's still communion with God. You know, if you're shaking your fist, or if you're weeping and complaining to God, you're still communicating with God. It's still directed toward Him. And let me tell you, that's the direction it should be going. There's value there. And lastly, lament is where we wait. I don't like waiting. I don't think you like waiting. With Cindy's brother's death, we'd make some calls and we had to wait. We make some calls, we had to wait. We hate waiting. You go to the doctor's office and you have the examination and then you wait. You have the test and then you wait. But you see, when there isn't an answer yet, there is only one place to be, in waiting. And if we are uncomfortable during that process, then it becomes lament. Now, let me ask you a question. Do really spiritual people lament? Some of you are tempted to think no. I mean, you know you lament, but you would never admit it. Like to me, like, oh no, Pastor, I'm going to say, hey, God's on the throne. So do spiritual people lament? Open your Bible to John 11, and I'll let you make that. You do decide for yourself after we read this. John 11 is the story of Jesus and his friend Lazarus when he dies. Now the text will be in your notes there, but this, for the sake of our time this morning, somebody sends word to Jesus, hey, your friend Lazarus is dead. Now they've seen Jesus heal sick people before. And Lazarus is one of his best buds. Okay? He's only in Bethany, just a short hop over the turnpike here. And everybody expects Jesus to pick up his stuff and go hurry off. Instead, Jesus says, okay, well, we're going to give it a few days. And while Jesus is waiting, he gets word. Well, way to go, bud. Lazarus is dead now. So then he travels to Lazarus' home. Martha comes out. She says, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus has a conversation with her. He says, I am the resurrection. I'm here, and I am the resurrection. She says, yeah, I believe it. I believe that someday he'll rise. She didn't understand. Then later she goes and gets Martha. Martha comes out. What does Martha say? Or Mary say? I talk to Martha and then talk to Mary. And Mary comes out and she goes, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. They both said the same thing. It's interesting. It's verse 33 of John 11. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, it says he was moved deeply in spirit and he was troubled. That's speaking of Jesus. He says, where have you laid him? He asked. And they said, come and see, they replied. And then the shortest verse in the New Testament, verse 35, Jesus wept. Others said, look how he loved him. And then still some others said, yeah, but he could open the eyes of a blind man. That was just a few chapters earlier. Surely he could have kept this man from dying. Verse 38, Jesus once more, he says, was moved deeply. He came to the tomb. You see that? He wasn't just it was moved over and over again. Waves of emotion coming. Can you relate? It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor. He's been in there for 4 days. Then Jesus said, didn't I tell you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. What prayer did he pray that he knew the Father had heard? I thought about this. Well, they were just talking about the fact that by now the place should stink. I wonder if Jesus said, Father, make sure he does not decay before I get there. Anyway, they rolled back the stone. And of course, Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. And he came out with his hands and feet still wrapped with the cloths of linen. So here's the question regarding lament. Why did Jesus cry? See, there's a paradox here. It says, I think this is a hint as to how we're supposed to respond during these times. Jesus, who has prayed to the Father and got an answer. Jesus, who is taking charge of this scene. Jesus, who knows what he's going to do next. Jesus, who knows exactly what's going to happen next. But he's the one who weeps at Lazarus' tomb. Maybe the horror of death, the fact that it sneers in the face of all that is lovely and beautiful, is overwhelming even for the Lord of life. Well, especially for the Lord of life. So individually and corporately, followers of Jesus should follow his example. We should lament. We should lament the loss of life from this virus. We should lament the excessive use of force that results in injury or death. We should lament random shootings. Philadelphia. We should lament the loss of economic security, of good health care. We should lament the loss of housing, even food. And we should avoid the controversies of who might be to blame or what God might be doing through all this, and instead focus on love and mercy. Now, I've got to admit to you that I've done this myself. How many times have I said to you that I believe that God could open up an opportunity for the gospel through all of this? And I still believe that. But that's not why this is happening. Do you know why this is happening? Me either. That's above our pay grade. So what do we do in the meantime? We love and we show mercy. We lament. You know, it's kind of interesting to notice how Jesus handled the issue of blame. I mentioned, just a few chapters before this, in John chapter 9, he healed a blind man. In fact, flip in your Bible to there, starting in verse 1, John 9:1. As he went along, he saw a blind man, blind from birth. The disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Which is the dumbest question in the world. If he was born blind, how could he have sinned anyway? And Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. You see, there was a common idea out there, and Jesus is saying, you have heard, but I'm telling you. We're going to talk about that next week. This thing that Jesus does. You've heard, but I'm going to tell you something different. He says, but this has happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and he put it in the man's eyes. I want you to notice, Jesus was not confused by the leading question that was put to him. He didn't buy into the thoughts that were so common to others around him. Instead of looking back, taking the bait, so how did this happen? What should have happened? Is there something wrong with the birthing process in our country? Is there something wrong with this genetic? He doesn't take the bait. He doesn't look back. Why? Instead, Jesus looked forward. He didn't want to talk about how this guy was blind. He wants to talk about what's going to happen when he's not. What's going to be displayed through this? Jesus said that the works of God would be displayed. And then, right after he said that, Jesus himself got to work. There's something there for us. There is something we're supposed to do. This same idea of looking forward for the next chance to serve. We see it in the early church too. In Acts 11, there's a story where there's a prophet, Agabus, and he speaks to the disciples and he says, look, the Lord has shown me that there's going to be a famine, a severe famine that covers the entire Roman Empire. And it's kind of interesting how they responded. Did the disciples say, oh, there is? Why is God doing this? Why is he doing it now? What does it mean? Could Jesus be coming back? They didn't respond like that at all. They get the word that there's going to be a famine. Start in verse 27 of Acts 11. We read this. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. It happened during the reign of Claudius. And the disciples, each one was able to decide to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. They did this, sending their gift with the elders by Barnabas and Saul. So they heard that there was going to be a pandemic. Well, not really. Famine, but pandemic for them. And what did they do? They got right to work. They figured out who was going to need the most help. The poor people in Judea, Jerusalem. They decided how they were going to respond. They took up a collection. They each gave what they could afford to give. And then they decided who was going to take that gift to the people who needed it. That was their plan. Pretty practical, huh? Look, we're going to see, and we're going to talk about this next week. It was always God's intention to care for creation with the help of humans who were loyal to him. That's what was supposed to happen in the garden, and that's what he is restoring now. Jesus, through the church, is restoring creation back to what he intended. Now, to be fair, sometimes the hardest part of figuring out how to best help. It's always been the reflex of Christians to run into trouble in order to help. In the earliest centuries, during plagues and pandemics, it was always the Christians who were running to the source of problems. Everybody else who was rich, everybody who could leave the town, usually cities where kind of the air was poor and the quality, whatever, people would run for the hills to be healthier. And while all the rich people were leaving, Christians would be going in to the city to care for the sick. Now, today we see some of that. Many of our physicians, and there's other organizations, even in our government, they have this idea of going and helping those who need help. I want to tell you that that wasn't normal. It didn't start happening until Christians did it. Now, parts of our culture pick it up. In fact, now they act like, well, the church should stay out of it because it's now government's business. But in the old days, to become a doctor, that was very costly. And medicines were costly. And so if you could pay, then they would help you. But if you couldn't pay, sorry. And it was the Christians who changed that. It was the Christians who started schools for those who couldn't go to school. It was the Christians who created orphanages for those who didn't have parents. They created hospitals for those who couldn't afford care. That's what the church did. Now some people would like you to believe that, it's not our business, but we started it. Now, to be honest, sometimes our instincts run contrary to what's best. Sometimes running in and helping isn't helping. And I found something that I thought was kind of interesting. How about a letter from a pastor in 1527? You've heard of this pastor. In fact, he was the bishop of the area. His name was Martin Luther. And I want to read you part of a letter that he wrote in 1527. It's a package of letters called Letters of Spiritual Counsel, but they're all dated 1527. He's writing to other parish pastors. He writes this: with God's permission, the enemy has sent poison and deadly dung among us. And so I will pray to God that he may be gracious and preserve us. You see, they were experiencing plagues. Then I will fumigate to purify the air. I will give and take medicine and avoid places and persons where I am not needed, in order that I may not abuse myself, and that through me others may not be infected and inflamed, with the result that I become the cause of their death through my negligence. Wow, what does Martin Luther understood social distancing? Isn't that bizarre? If God wishes to take me, he will be able to find me. At least I have done what he gave me to do, and I am responsible neither for my own death nor for the death of others. But if my neighbor needs me, I shall avoid neither person nor place, but feel free to visit and to help him. We have more, and it goes on. But so even Martin Luther understood that even though sometimes it was normal for Christians to rush in and help, unless, of course, going and helping becomes part of the problem, and then he will withhold himself. This is not new, you guys. Now, all of the politics and all the pontificating and all the social media, we get bombarded with it. But this is not new. Relax. And as we wait to try to understand what is God doing, there will be times of lament. Now, next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the tension that exists between self-isolating to promote health and safety versus what the church is supposed to be and do. The truth is that there are a lot of people that are trying to tell us that faith should be a private thing only. And I don't believe that for a minute. Church is a team sport. We have to meet together to be able to do the one another's. But what if meeting together puts others at risk? Then how do we balance that? We're going to wrestle with that a little bit. And there's a bigger question. How do we reach an increasingly post-Christian culture? We're going to talk about that because I think starting next week, we should start praying and seeking and coming up with a plan of what we do to be a help, a bigger help to our culture. But for today, number one, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. Lament the losses. Admit that it feels terrible to not know what's going on. Some of you are going to have to say it out loud. I don't know. Why is this happening? I don't know. What's going to happen next? I don't know. What should I be doing? I don't know. And then follow Jesus' example. Show up where you can for those who are near you. Love them. Please don't get distracted with the debates. You know, I've talked to people these last 2 weeks. Some people talked about what a terrible person President Trump was. Somebody talked about what a terrible person Mr. Biden was. Somebody talked about the Republicans. Somebody else talked about, they were saying the same thing about the, They all have their pet things. As long as he protects that, he can do whatever else he wants. We all feel that tension. I'm going to encourage you to try to not be distracted by those debates and by the politics. And instead, focus on finding a way to love somebody nearby. We're going to close with this passage this morning. Thanks for hanging in there. 36 minutes. Sorry about that. 1 John 3. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But 1 John 3:16 says something different. It says this. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, that we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with action and with truth. And next week, we're going to try to figure out what some of that action looks like. But for now, let me pray with you. Lord Jesus, we just have to admit, we don't know what's going on. We don't know who to believe. We feel like we're being pulled and tugged in every direction. We want to rest and trust you. If we're honest, we want everything to go back to the way it was. But more than that, we want your will. We want to be found faithful to you in this time, but we're not even sure what that looks like. And so would you guide us? And I pray that your Spirit would help us to know what love is demanding from us. Make us willing to do that. Sometimes it's going to mean isolating, and other times it's going to mean putting ourselves at risk. we're not always going to get it right. But would you help us to know? Because we can't really start living if we don't get out of the car. So help us to know what it means. Help us to follow you. And give us peace. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks. God bless.
The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you and within you. He is with you, he is with you in the morning, in the evening, in your coming and your going, in your weeping and rejoicing. He is for you, he is for you.